Hello and welcome to Your Library at Home. My name's Sam Hagan. I manage the library's public programming team. I'd like to begin this evening by acknowledging that we meet on country. I live and work on Gadigal land, and I'd like to take this opportunity to pay my respects to elders past, present, and especially emerging. I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal Australians who may be joining us this evening. So, welcome to the library's favourite book club, the B List, with Bri Lee. Tonight, we're really excited to hear from Bri and her guest, Patrick Mullins, who is very well known to the library audiences. So we're very pleased that he's going to be with us. In a sec, I'm going to hand over to Bri, but before I do, I'd just like to remind you that the library is maintaining our online program of talks and workshops. Upcoming highlights include the Bad Crime Writers Festival, which is to be held on the 7th and 8th of November. And then on the 12th of November, a conversation about the Korean novel Kim Ji-young, born 1982, which was authored by Cho Nam-yu. I think will be a really interesting discussion. Bri will have more news about the next B-List events, so it gives me great pleasure to hand over to her. Are you there, Bri?
Good evening. Hello. Thank you, Sam. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another B-List. Thank you so much for deciding to spend your Thursday evening with us. I would like to also acknowledge that where I am in my lounge room is on Gadigal land. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And when I say that, I mean that I also recognise that sovereignty was never ceded and we still don't have a treaty. And I support the Uluru Statement from the heart. I am so excited to talk about tonight's book. It has everything I love in a book. It's funny, courtroom drama, really great sort of literary world like gossip and drama, and also Australia's modern history. Of course, it is The Trials of Portnoy by Patrick Mullins. Patrick Mullins is a Canberra-based academic and writer. He has a PhD from the University of Canberra, and his first book, Tiberius with a Telephone, a biography of former Prime Minister William McMahon, was published by Scribe in 2018, and it just won the National Biography Award run by the State Library of New South Wales. His second book is this one, The Trials of Portnoy, which we will be discussing this evening, and it's fantastic. Patrick, are you there?
Hey, Bri. Yeah, I am. Hey,
wonderful. Good, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Very honoured. It's great.
I love your book. Hilarious, fascinating. I want to start with a really sort of basic question, which is your last book was about, I love that the sort of sales tagline was a biography of Australia's worst Prime Minister. And now this, how did you, oh, sorry.
Have to update that type. We've had a few copies since, so.
I want to know how you came to decide to write what you cover in The Trials of Portnoy.
So in 2018, Philip Roth died I think it was May 2018. And at that time, I was just finishing up work on the Billy McMahon book. And I was kind of casting around for a new project. And when he died, there was all this kind of gushing obituaries and stuff about his career and how wonderful a writer he was. But I found two mentions of these trials in columns written in The Guardian and the Fin Review. And seeing them, I kind of thought, hey, that's interesting. That's kind of curious. Both of these articles mentioned that these trials had taken place, that Australia had censorship, and that this book had kind of helped break it down. I knew Australia already had censorship, but I didn't know about Portnoy's complaint. And it seemed to me that these were kind of like our versions of the Lady Chatterley's Lover trials, which are these seminal kind of censorship trials over in the UK in the 60s. So kind of getting curious, I began looking around and thinking about, is this what's going on here? What's up with it? And eventually I went up to Sydney and took a look at the court transcripts in the New South Wales State Archives. And I was reading the transcripts, and the big thing I was struck by in them was how wonderfully eloquent and articulate all the academics were, and how ridiculously stupid and comedic all the prosecuting questions were, because they were literally just asking about masturbation and arguing about masturbation. And I don't know, masturbation just seems really funny. So I just thought, okay, this is interesting, this is funny, and this should be something that's more widely known.
We're going to get to that hilarity in a moment. I do just want to remind everyone watching at home that, of course, we will be taking some audience questions towards the end of tonight, and I will be moderating those this evening. And at any point in time, you don't have to wait to the end. You can find the little Q&A chat box function and type them in, and I'll go through those with Patrick at the end. Patrick, the situation in Australia was pretty embarrassing pre-Portnoy. Can you talk a little bit about that time and just how insulated Australia was and who was really passionate about keeping it that way? How like backwards it was?
Yeah, so how to say this? The tagline always was that Australia was the island of the South Pacific. We think of kind of like the Menzies era and the 1950s as being this kind of dry, boring, safe, very conservative kind of culture. And in part that's because the Australian government had set up a censorship system that at its height was the most conservative, the most strict in the world. We kept out books that were depicting sex, that were talking about sex, that were using four-letter words like fuck, shit, etc., etc. And we were, we didn't want those kind of books in here because our governments thought that those kind of books would corrupt us and deprave us. And because we were an outpost of the British Empire, and because we were white, and because we could be kept pure in that way, they wanted to keep us uncorrupted. And so we would stop this kind of material, stop it getting to Australia, and we'd strip it out wherever it was found in Australia. And basically over time, we became this quite conservative kind of society where you'd never see sex depicted in a book. I think it's Dorothy Hewitt joked that there's a whole generation of Australian fiction where everybody seems born by immaculate conception, which is, a wonderful kind of thing, but also a bit daft as well. So it was a kind of safe, dry, conservative, white, straight, masculine, patriarchal kind of society that was depicted and reflected in the books that were allowed to be published here, and in the books that we actually ourselves published. So yeah, does that answer the question, kind of?
Yeah, definitely. And what is the overlap? There were bits in the book that suggested that there was also a kind of wariness of like communism or Marxism, and that perhaps the political tools and processes that had been developed to sort of stop the like scary sex stuff was also like with an ulterior motive for almost like political conservatism as well.
Yeah. So the sex stuff is the more eye-catching, definitely. But there was a really strong political element in this and political ideology to it. As I say, Australia was this outpost of the British Empire, and it had been set up kind of in accord with the British Empire. So kind of stratified society where the rich were on top and it was the white straight males who were on top. And you had middle class women and working class below that. And so the censors in large part, and this is something worldwide, saw fads like modernism and postmodernism. They saw political ideologies like communism and socialism as being really dangerous to that order. And if you think of modernism, you can kind of see what they mean, because it takes on the hierarchical, and it's always about making things new, and it's always about kind of pulling apart and exploring the taboo. Like you think of Ulysses, and there's there's masturbation, there's infidelity, there's all sorts of stuff going on there. So the idea was that these ideologies would upset Australia, and they would upset the social order. There's a novel called Upsurge, which was produced in the 1920s, and it actually satirizes the judiciary. It's got a magistrate who takes a piss, basically, and it depicts that. And because of that, that book was banned. The idea was that that's a kind of social realism that we just didn't need because, heaven forbid, people knew that magistrates took a leak occasionally. So, yeah, it was all about kind of preserving this certain idea. And there's an element of nation building in this. One of the things that happened really early on after Australia federated was the New South Wales government held a royal commission into the declining birth rate. And the idea was, their conclusion was that the decline in the birth rate was because the morality of people was being corrupted and people were able to access too easily information about abortion and contraception. So notwithstanding that there were already judicial rulings saying you couldn't class that as obscene or indecent, customs clerks started to ban that stuff, and police started to seize that stuff. So trying to, again, promulgate and build this nation that was going to be pure, that was going to be straight, that was going to be white, that was going to venerate the king or queen, that was going to be thrall to all these kind of ideas of imperialism, that was going to have no truck with the dirty communists. That was all kind of the idea behind this censorship system. And it endured and just kept on going, just self-generated over and over again.
Shout out for any regular attendees of B-List Book Club. You might remember that if you listened into my conversation with Liz Allen, the demographer who wrote The Story of Us, that she mentioned too about the findings of that like national inquiry into the declining birth rate and just the kind of like moral outrage and panic that resulted from the findings of sort of, the terror that we were losing the national identity of women making many, many babies. Patrick, something I find really interesting, and it was in the coverage, some of the coverage of your book as well, is that we have this enduring like national myth of Australia being really relaxed and kind of like open and easygoing, and not at all like those people with like a stick up their ass in like London, or those Brits who are like whatever. I mean, what's your take on like, just your book outlines so clearly how that is just it's a myth that is just not at all how this country was built. Why do we have this kind of idea of Australia being one thing, but actually history being so completely different?
I think in some ways we have that idea because we don't have like a landed gentry. We don't have titles and things like that from the UK. But of course, at the same time, we do have so many features of that kind of class-based society. We had squatters, and we had convict stock, and we had British military. And so, there were kind of those semi-feudal kind of structures already present. But yeah, we were the most buttoned up, tight asses, wowzers, prudes going. Like it's ridiculous. I think in some ways it's because we like the image that we have of ourselves is something we like to promote, but at the same time, we like to preserve that image. We like to think that image is, there can never be anything wrong with it. And so very often we'd see literature that depicted, say, sex or depicted violence or depicted Marxism as a threat to that kind of wholesome conservative image of ourselves that we had as being relaxed and comfortable. So even though the two were kind of, at loggerheads, it was a kind of subliminal fight. But it's worth saying, like, there was always kind of some people who said that this country is not as relaxed as it likes to think, that it is one that is really buttoned up. And those people were pressing for the end of censorship right from the beginning, even from before the federal system was even erected.
This is perfect. I wanted to ask you next anyway about some of the instances of people pushing back against the censorship laws. So this is pre-Portnoy, like the sort of trials or the controversy around Philip Roth's book. But can you talk about some of the instances of like the university newspapers in particular, and the kind of the early parts of the book document some hilarity of people deliberately publishing obscenities, just and not trying to have them justified by like literary merit or artistic merit, but just saying that they should be able to publish obscenities in and of themselves.
Yeah, so the most notorious, like the biggest, the most infamous, and I think as well the most consequential, is Wendy Bacon and Tharunka, which is the university newspaper of Uni of New South Wales. Great university. So one of the things that had happened in the 1960s was that judiciaries in the UK and the US had started to carve out an exemption for obscene material. You could publish obscene material so long as it had literary merit, that it was literature, that kind of rarefied air. Now that on one hand kind of allowed lots of books to start getting published because they were of literary merit. But Wendy Bacon and the people at Tharunka said that that idea of literary merit is just bunkum, that it's kind of, it makes this elitist, high class kind of distinction. And that it fed into actually the debate about censorship. It played on the censor's turf in the sense that it would allow tasteful erotica, in a hardcover that's leather bound and really expensive to be published, but it would not allow sorry, that's my dog. Sorry.
All good.
That you would allow kind of this hardcover, really high class porn, basically, available to the rich, but not available to the working classes because on one hand it had literary merit, but on the other hand it was too expensive for working class people to have. So they were saying like that literary merit distinction is rubbish and we need to basically ignore it, just leave it alone. So they started publishing deliberate filth, stuff that they knew was going to offend people. And the big song that they came up with and decided to publish in particular was one called Eskimo Nell. It's this really dirty, bawdy kind of poem. And it used to be sung at like and chanted in locker rooms. And it was like, you know, about blue-eyed Pete and knob-eyed Nell and Grangers, don't knock over my wine glass, please. And the idea kind of was that
all good.
But the idea was, Bacon's idea was kind of like, if you publish this stuff and say, look, it doesn't have any literary merit, it's just obscene, then you're going to force the censors to start taking you on your turf. And your turf here is obscenity is a viable and a worthwhile form of expression. You should be able to say the word fuck. You should be able to say the word, sorry, I don't want to say it, the C-bomb. But you know, you should be able to say those things, because if you keep hiding them and referring to them obliquely, then you're never going to talk about the actual issues that are raised, like rape, like sexual assault, like ideas about sexual power and independence and autonomy. So they were kind of just publishing this stuff, like, you know, just spewing it out. Like their paper is filthy. You can go and look at it online. It's wonderful to read. It's so refreshing. You will have no illusions about the human body afterward. There's stuff about chastity, about how to make marijuana and smoke it, all sorts of stuff. It's terrific. But the idea in doing so was that they were going to clog the courts. So every single time they published an issue, the authorities would have to charge them. And in doing so, that they would just constantly have court proceedings, and Bacon and her allies would just make a mockery of them. Bacon in particular famously showed up to one court proceeding wearing a nun's habit with the words, "I have been fucked by God's steel prick," embroidered on it. You know, the most filthy kind of thing you could possibly think of. And it just made a farce of this whole thing. And she got off. Like, she literally got off. The cops kind of like, all right, okay. And they just left it. But so that kind of student activism is a really important part of the censorship story, because it forced censorship into the headlines over and over and over again. And Bacon was kind of this unapologetic advocate that censorship prevented debate on so many issues around sex, around gender, around racism and discrimination, around class in particular. And so the censorship battles was kind of a gateway for them into something much bigger and much more important than just your ability to read, say, Lady Chatterley's Lover or Portnoy's Complaint, or even to read Eskimo Nell. Sorry.
That's all right. I want to talk a bit more about this idea of literary merit or artistic merit as a defense. Can you talk a bit more about that? It just seems so, like, now looking back, it just seems so absurd to me that so many like legal professionals were sitting around debating what would classify as literary merit, as though that is something that could ever be decided sort of on the record formally. I mean, what was your take on that? Did the people at the time, did these legal professionals realize that it was kind of an absurdity, or was this still really a time where that they were under the impression that they could make a final ruling about whether or not something had artistic merit?
I think they absolutely were of that latter view, that they could make a determination. They could go, that is just pulp and that's crap. And, you know, the uneducated would read that and the swill would read that. But this here, this beautiful chrysalis, this is literary merit, this is literature, this is high art, you know. I think there were very much of that view, because that idea of literary merit does have a lot of class ideas bound up in it, you know, about language and about the references and the reading and things that underpin it, and the kind of constellations of references that you can find in a work. So they were definitely of the view that that existed, and that was a kind of easy, it sounds stupid to say, but that was an easy distinction that you could make between them. And in part that kind of rested on this idea that some works of literary merit would be almost unintelligible to the uneducated reader, who was likely to be the person most susceptible to being corrupted by that obscene literature. So, you know, like Ulysses, quite famously, is, you know, it's long, it's dense, it's difficult to read. And so, you know, if you, this sounds very snobbish, but maybe if you weren't as well educated, then maybe you wouldn't want to read the whole thing. Maybe you wouldn't put up with it. And so therefore, maybe you wouldn't be corrupted by it. But again, it is very much this classist kind of distinction of what is good and what is bad. And being able to say that something didn't have any literary merit or didn't aspire to have any kind of artistry to it would allow the authorities to seize the stuff that they thought was going to be most widely disseminated. Because the thing about them is that they really did fear that children, women, and the uneducated were going to get this material and they would be corrupted and they would be radicalized and they would kind of start pushing at upsetting the social order, whether by leading a revolution or by, not having babies anymore or anything like that. So that's kind of where it fed into. As we were saying, like the literary merit defense did kind of work for a while and it did help in the sense that a lot of books that would otherwise have been banned got out and got published because they could be argued to have that. So Ulysses was famously defended on that basis. Lady Chatterley's Lover was famously defended on that basis. And Portnoy's Complaint too was defended on that basis. But it effectively became really destabilized as people were able to kind of pull apart the low elements and the high elements of it. So it worked for a time, but it was also just a Pandora's box of, nightmares. In some of it backfired to some extent. Yeah.
Just reminding everyone watching that at any time you want, you can type questions into the chat box. Okay, I want to talk about Portnoy specifically. I'll throw you a grenade here and say, how would you describe the book?
Okay, I worked out a good paragraph for this, right? So
I'm ready. We're ready.
33-year-old Jewish American lawyer Alexander Portnoy lies on a psychiatrist's couch and narrates the course of his troubled life. Alexander Portnoy has become split amongst himself. He's torn himself in two. On one hand, he wants to be the good little Jewish boy that his mother has always told him he is. On the other hand, he wants to be absolutely anything but. He wants to be bad. He wants to be naughty. He wants to be American. So when he's a kid, this rebellion, this tearing himself apart, takes the form of a desire to masturbate compulsively. He jacks off into his sister's underwear. He jacks off into a cord apple, into a toilet roll that he's greased with Vaseline, bizarrely. The thing is that every single time he does this, every single time he masturbates, so he doesn't get any kind of pleasure from it. It's immediately smothered by a sense of guilt and shame. And so he starts to transgress again and again. That guilt and shame become anger. And so he keeps rebelling, keeps acting out. As he gets older, it becomes this really flagrant licentiousness, these affairs of the flesh with women. And he keeps going down the spiral, but by the end, of course, it's self-negating. He is alienated, isolated, can't form a spiritual connection with anyone. And of course, he's torn himself apart. So he ends the novel screaming in agony. At which point his listening doctor cracks a joke and says, "Now, perhaps we may start to begin." There you go. How's that for a paragraph about the book? That was the deal I memorized.
Expertly handled. So
I don't know how much that gets of it, but
I couldn't, not that I couldn't believe, I just shocked but not surprised, actually, I suppose, that Portnoy's Complaint came out by Philip Roth at a time when, if you went to sort of any Australian school, boys were still being told that if they masturbated, they would go blind.
Can you taught that back in like 2002, 2003? That's still kind of maybe on the cards. So yeah, just.
Oh yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about, I suppose, the reception of the book overseas and just how, yes, it was controversial, but also quite revelatory. And then the contrast when there was even a thought of it coming out in Australia and how that wall came up sort of immediately.
Yeah. So the description I gave just before makes Portnoy sound like it's kind of quite serious. And it is. It does have a really serious core to it. But it is also a really funny book in the sense that Roth laughs at sex and Portnoy himself is this articulate, learned kind of guy who makes lots of puns. Like he talks about publicly pleasing his parents while privately pulling his puts, which is like the best sentence ever to be able to say aloud in public. But, you know, he satirizes all those kind of tropes and fears about masturbation, about sex. Like there's one point where he jerks off into his eye and he fears for a while that he's going to go blind. Like he literally talks about how he's going to go blind for a page and a half. It's ridiculous. But the thing is, the book is published in 1969 over in the US, and public appetite for the book was really already whetted because Roth had published extracts in various magazines like Esquire and the Partisan Review. And so it also came at a time when there was a lot more sex, and so when sex was being explored as a topic in a lot of film and a lot of music. There's a wonderful book by an American journalist called Robert Hofstadter that's called Sexplosion, and it's all about pop art and the infusion of sex into literature and film in this time. And, you know, you can think of things like Gore Vidal and his books about sex. You know, they're just everywhere at this point. So on one hand, it's a salacious book that attracts a lot of public attention. But it also, when it came out, Portnoy's Complaint was a critical darling. Like, people gushed over it, how good it was. They said, this thing's fantastic. You know, the form, that psychological monologue hadn't really been done before. And the voice in it was just really compelling. It's kind of, if you read it today, it's almost a bit like a shtick in some ways, because it's kind of become quite normalized. But at the time it was something new. And so it was notorious and at the same time adored. So people bought it in droves. It sold enormously over in the US. It literally, in the first year, it outsold The Godfather, which, you know, is a seminal kind of book over in the States. Same thing happened over in the UK. It was, again, critical darling and sold enormous number of copies. But of course, the publishers then tried to sell it and bring it to Australia, at which point Australia's federal system of censors got their nose up and said, no way in living hell are we going to let that book into this country. The book was banned, first of all, in, I think it was about April 1969. And then you had, over the course of 1969, repeated appeals to overcome that ban, each of which, though, was denied. The ban was removed. Portnoy's Complaint was just not coming into Australia. We thought it had too much sex, there was too many four-letter words, and the blasphemy in it. And it's worth saying blasphemy, we haven't mentioned this, but the satire of God, you know, was this idea that Australia is a Christian nation, a Christian Anglican nation. That was a kind of a big tenet of the censorship system. And so Portnoy's Complaint, you know, which rails against God and rails against Judaism and has sex and has violence, and it's not violence, so four-letter words, kind of, it ticked all the boxes for ban the thing. So, you know, even if the God hadn't been in there, the sex would have been enough to keep it out. Yeah.
Okay, leaving Portnoy aside for just a moment, something I absolutely loved about this book was sort of the portraits you paint of some of the key players in the literature and sort of publishing industry in Australia at that time, who ended up being, sort of protagonists, I guess, in this story. Can you introduce us to that sort of the main man? Is it Mitchie or Mishi? Mitchie? Mickey. I've never even heard his name pronounced out loud. Mickey and the others.
Yeah, so Penguin Books is the big player in all this. At this time, Penguin was about 20 years old. It had been set up in Australia in 1946, and it had just started publishing its own books. So before then, it just shipped all the books in from the UK and published them. But in the early 1960s, Geoffrey Dutton, Max Harris, and Brian Stonier, who are three pretty important guys in Australian literature, started their own list, and they started publishing books like The Lucky Country. By the mid-1960s, John Mickey had come in and taken over. And Mickey was kind of this bluff, determined, smart, charismatic
sailor.
Yeah, he's a sailor. He sailed once all on his own to New Zealand and back and said it was Sibelius all the way. I don't even know what that means, but Hilary McPhee, who was married to Mickey, told me actually that at one point when he was young, he went overseas, I think it was to Bangladesh, maybe it was to Burma, but that a movie was being filmed at the time with Humphrey Bogart, and that he was Bogart's stunt double or something in a scene. Charismatic guy, quite handsome, very, very intelligent, very, very sharp. And he had underneath him at Penguin two guys, John Hooker, first of all, non-fiction editor, and a sometime novelist, who was kind of this left-leaning, rebellious, kind of pirate-like guy. People described him to me as a pirate. He was kind of swashbuckling, I guess. who was responsible for commissioning some really important books. Anne Summers' Dan Horse and God's Police was commissioned by Hooker. He approached her to get that book. Humphrey McQueen's The New Britannia, that was also Hooker. He in fact showed up when Mickey suggested that he apply for this job at Penguin. Hooker showed up at Mickey's door one night with a bottle of red and a list of books that he wanted to write, to have in the Penguin stable. So he was like this charismatic, really enthusiastic kind of guy. And then finally they had a guy called Peter Froelich, who is still alive and living up in Queensland, who looked after Penguin's numbers, basically made sure that everything was efficient and that everything was kind of logistically tight, like that they could get books out, whether to Darwin or to Hobart or Perth or Sydney, as quickly as possible and cheaply as possible, which became really critical. Penguin in Australia was like ginormously successful in terms of profits, to the point that it actually propped up British Penguin for a long time in the 1960s and 1970s. And all three of these guys at Penguin were really enthusiastic and idealistic about what literature could do in a country like Australia. They all saw literature as having this vital function for Granger. Sorry, she had a tongue in my wine glass.
All good.
Yeah, so they were really idealistic, and they kind of said that, Menzies had gone by this point. Rob Menzies had been Prime Minister for 16 years and he'd gone, and you had the Holt government and the Gorton government and McMahon coming to power. And Whitlam, was in the wings. He was the coming man. And so Australia was starting to move along. And these guys and the other staff at Penguin saw a space where literature could shape culture and could have an outsized influence on it. So that's why you had these books like The Lucky Country, The Tyranny of Distance, in fact, by Jeff Blaney. That was actually originally a Penguin book commissioned by them. And that's a seminal work now in Australian history. So Penguin were really important, and they obviously became the prime movers in Portnoy's complaint. But the other guys who figured in this, of course, are Angus and Robertson, who, I don't know if they're still around. I think they own Booktopia, but otherwise I think they're gone. Is that right?
Really? I didn't know that. But I don't think they have bricks and mortar stores anymore.
No, they don't. But they used to be the big time. They were the top notch, top of the tree for Australian publishing. And they ran really successful stores around Australia. But in 1970, they got taken over by a guy called Gordon Barton, who was kind of this early vulture capitalist kind of guy. He had some really weird sex fetishes, actually. He used to dress up in night armor and then be rode around Sydney Islands. Really weird guy. But also a guy who was really interested in culture and in politics. And when, we'll come to this, but he was passionate about literature and what it could do. And yeah, those are the kind of main players here, though, in this story. Yeah.
Okay, I want you to come back a little bit to Froelich's contribution, or well, I suppose also Mickey's kind of masterminding. And for people who haven't read the book, can you explain how they sort of hatched their plan for and what was like a really bold, kind of crazy, harebrained scheme for just disseminating Portnoy's complaint like en masse?
So risky.
Yeah.
So Portnoy's complaint was banned. It was, you could not have it in the country. If you had it in the country, you'd be prosecuted. And other publishers had tried to bring the book in and they'd been rebuffed. So Penguin decided, though, that they wanted to take censorship on. They wanted to basically do in Australia what they'd done in the UK with Lady Shatterley's Lover. So they decided they were going to do it. They bought the rights for $10,000 Australian, which is a lot more money back then than it is now. It's a huge amount of money. They smuggled 3 copies of the book into the country, and in big secrecy, they got a printer up in Sydney who was related to Angus and Robertson to print the book for them. And this is where Peter Froelich's kind of talents became like really crucial, because he had kind of worked out Penguin's distribution system so that any orders that were placed for the book could be packed and dispatched within a matter of hours, like they would be gone. So 75,000 copies were originally printed of Portnoy's complaint, and 35,000 of them came down to Melbourne Penguin's
I should just say, sorry, for people who aren't familiar with the industry, like even today, 75,000 copies of a first print run is stratospheric. Like back then, that is nuts.
Yeah. So back then, selling 10,000 copies of a paperback book in a year was enough to make it a bestseller.
Yeah.
So, 75,000 is a huge investment of money to print it, and of course to sell it. But the risk always was that the police would swoop in and seize all of them, because if they got their hands on them, they could burn them all, and the money's gone. Like the rights, they're gone, the book's gone, you've got nothing, and you've laid yourself open to criminal prosecution at the same time. So it was really risky. But Froelich's talents for distribution and logistics made it so that the books arrived in Penguin and then they were gone within 24 hours. So you had these convoys of trucks spreading across the country late in winter of 1970 to bookstores everywhere, over in Perth, over in Darwin, up in Queensland, down in Tasmania. They were spreading everywhere. And the idea was that they would all arrive in bookstores on the exact same day so that they could be unveiled around the country at the same time. The same day, the first day of spring 1970. Massively risky, but also deliberate, because if they did this, if they unveiled all these books around the country, they would get newspaper headlines, but also they would trigger prosecutions in every single state around the country, because we not only had a federal system of censorship at the federal government level to keep books out, we also had state-based censorship where each and every single one of the states had a jurisdiction and they had their own obscenity laws, and they had all promised to prosecute, except for South Australia.
Yeah, okay, good. This is perfect timing. For people who don't, so let's say just people who aren't really familiar with the law in all of this, can you explain why it was so critical that, and I suppose a bit of background, how all of the states had technically could have or did have separate censorship laws, but how they'd kind of agreed to present a united front. And then I guess the breakdown or how critical and important it was when South Australia broke that pact.
So before Federation, every single one of the colonies, South Australia, Queensland, all that, they're all separate jurisdictions. They all passed their own obscenity laws and indecency laws. When Australia federated, those laws were inherited by the states, and they became the state-based censorship systems by which the police and the state authorities could remove books that were produced in Australia. So they could go after Australian writers. So if I wrote the word fuck in my book, they could come after me and they could seize my book and etc. And that system had worked pretty well for quite a while. But in the 1960s, censorship activists kind of started to probe at this and say, hang on a second, we've got seven different censorship authorities. And if we maybe can convince one not to prosecute, then, they'll look inconsistent, they'll look silly. And this had been exploited when The Trial of Lady Chatterley's Lover had been published illegally in Australia in 1964. New South Wales said, we're not going to prosecute, that's just stupid. Victoria said, we are going to prosecute. They eventually dropped it, but they looked pretty daft in the meantime. And so one of the things that the federal government did was try to come up with this idea for a uniform censorship system, where if the federal government banned it, then everyone had to ban it and everyone had to prosecute. The thing is that at that time, all of the governments were Liberal. They're all Liberal Party governments. So when the Labor Party won in South Australia, one government under Don Dunstan in 1969, suddenly that kind of uniformity was broken. And the Labor Party had agreed that it was going to reform censorship processes in accordance with the belief that if you were an adult, you could read whatever you wanted, really. So when Penguin came out in 1970 and published Portnoy's complaint, all of the Liberal governments around the country were like, hell yeah, we're going to take you to the cleaners. But the Labor government of Don Dunstan said straight away, we're not going to prosecute so long as you don't sell it to people under the age of 18. And that became critical because suddenly you couldn't buy it in Victoria. You couldn't buy it, you couldn't ostensibly buy it in Victoria or New South Wales, but you could buy it in South Australia. And this was kind of just, it kicked a hole in that system of uniform censorship. And basically, as the court trials then took place over whether or not Portnoy was obscene and was indecent and therefore illegal to sell, that system became more and more destabilized and it became more and more inconsistent. And it looked stupider and stupider by the day.
For anyone who hasn't read the book, there are some pretty good scenes where that depict booksellers like getting it in box, getting Portnoy's complaint in boxes and just selling it in sort of like brown paper bags, but also there are people lined up down the street who want their copies. Just like this sort of chaos, hilarious chaos around something that sort of is illegal, but everyone's like so excited to be kind of making a point, but also just so wanting to read this book that has been banned. And like, yeah, I just feel like Mickey and Penguin's plan just chef's kiss, like worked to a T.
They were crowing when it happened. They were like, this has worked better than we possibly could have thought, because it did. It was just a shitstorm for the authorities. It really was.
Talk us through the timeline, just sort of an overarching timeline of the trials.
Okay, so the trials, first thing I have to say is the trials move really fast. These days, a court trial takes, it's a long time in the prep and then a long time to actually take place, and there's postponements and everything. These ones move really, really fast. Portnoy's complaint was published on 1 September 1970. The first trial for Portnoy began in November 1970, so only a few months later.
That is just would never happen. Today.
It's ridiculous. One of the people who read it said to me, "No, they didn't happen that quickly, did that?" And I was like, "It did. I'm sorry." And she was like, "Jesus." So the first trial was in Victoria, obviously the place where the book had been published and where Penguin was headquartered. And it went for a few days in the Magistrates Court, Melbourne Magistrates Court. And basically you just had this parade of academics and writers and people coming forward to testify that the book had literary merit. There's some literary luminaries came to this trial, people like Manning Clark, people like Patrick White, enormously talented people came to defend this book and defend literature, in effect. The trial ended with a guilty verdict. So Penguin was found guilty of publishing an obscene book, but they were fined $104.50. That's it. So, on one hand, they lost, they lost the court battle, but they didn't get fined very much, considering they had sold, that's the other thing I didn't mention, 75,000 copy print run sold out in 2 weeks. So gone. The book was gone, So
and then Mickey was like, they were like saying they were going to prosecute, and Mickey was like, "Yeah, it doesn't matter. We already sent it off for a second print run."
Yeah,
he was just poking the bear, like.
And he said, "We're going to write a book about the trials. We're going to write a book about these trials and make them look even stupider." It's like, so Victoria happened. They got fined $104.50. Then over in New South Wales, we had a long series of committal hearings over booksellers there who were going to get tried for selling the book. Then in Western Australia, that was the next big trial, where the manageress of a Communist Party-owned bookshop called the Pioneer Bookshop, which was this kind of jumble of, Marxist and Trotsky and all this kind of stuff. Like, it was a knockabout book, really. But they got charged with it, and they won. Ridiculously, they won. And the effect of that was that suddenly the book was available in South Australia and in WA. So, nothing good for the censorship authorities there. The next one, by the time we get into 1971, is happening in New South Wales. And this is kind of, I think, probably the biggest of the trials, because this was the first trial to actually take place before a jury. And it was also one of the trials where, New South Wales is the most populous state. Sydney is the residence of the most of the Australian press. So it was the biggest battle. And the jury hung. It couldn't come to a verdict. They couldn't decide. So suddenly you had this kind of weird interregnum situation where the book's available in 2 states, maybe is illegal in New South Wales, you're not really sure. And then, of course, you have these other trials that go on and that fail spectacularly, particularly down in Tasmania, where a PhD student tried to sell copies of the book to members of the Tasmanian State Parliament, was arrested by a police sergeant, charged, only to have the charges dismissed on the basis that the magistrate just thought that it was stupid. So gone, done. It was banned in the Northern Territory. A magistrate's court there decided that the book didn't really find a bookseller and local councilman for selling the book. But again, you now had the book available in Tasmania, South Australia, WA, not available in the Northern Territory and Victoria. New South Wales, the second trial happens, and it's a repeat of the first. The jury again is hung. So this ridiculous situation where the book is available, not available, and the federal government at that point were like, all right, we're stuffed, we're dead, we're killed, this is over. Release the book. They released Portnoy's complaint. They said, we're allowing it into the country, we're allowing it into Australia. And they took it off the banned list. But even then it's not over, because Queensland still decided to prosecute. It prosecuted 2 cases in 1972 and 1973, people for selling the book, and they were both found guilty. They were both fined about like $20, not much, but still. But yeah, so it was a farce. It was ridiculous. Just this long series of trials that ended with the egg all over the authorities' faces.
Wonderful. I love it. I only have 1 or 2 more questions for Patrick, and then I can see we've got some questions lined up from the audience. But if you've been sitting on something, please take a moment to type it in now. I want to just ask you about some of your favorite bits, particularly from the trial content. You know, you mentioned right at the beginning that that was a catalyst for you deciding to write the book, was because you were going through the transcript. Like, one of my favorite bits was at one stage, one of the judges told the jurors that they had to read the book in the jury room. He wouldn't like let them go home with it to just sort of read it in their homes. And just the thought of 12 strangers all sitting silently in a room for 2 days reading this book that is just all about masturbation and stuff is just so hilarious. And so much of the stuff that happened during the trials was just so ridiculous and hilarious. So I just wanted to hear from you if you had any sort of favorite or funniest bits that you came across.
Okay, so probably my favorite bit, and it's not a funny bit really, but I think it's one that kind of made me go, Jesus, these academics, the people who testified, had some courage and had some learning. And that was when Harry Heseltine was testifying in the New South Wales trial. The prosecutor was trying to make this argument that Portnoy was depraved and that he was a horrible person, he was a pervert. And, you know, if you liked the book, then you too must be a pervert and you must be disgusting and all this kind of stuff. And Heseltine invoked the Roman dramatist Terence, who said that nothing that is human is alien to me. He was kind of trying to say that this is something we should feel compassion for. You know, Portnoy might be a pervert and he might be a dirty little boy, but we can still feel sorry for him and we can still feel pity for him. And to me, that just kind of smacked of the most human and wise kind of understanding that I think literature kind of helps to inculcate and helps us actually to grow within ourselves, this ability to step into other people's shoes. And that, you know, he quoted it in Latin, like, and then he translated it for the benefit of the jury and the thing. And I was just like, A, the learning on that guy, and B, the stones on him today to do that, you know, to literally then turn around and be like, by the way, Mr. Prosecutor, in case you don't know your Latin, this is what it is. You know, I just thought it's wise, it's intelligent, it's courageous. And as an academic, that's the kind of thing that I just have to admire that so much. But the next thing, the funniest part, I think, for me is perhaps when Patrick White was on the stand. Patrick White at this point was like 2 years off winning the Nobel Prize, and he was old, you know, he had these false teeth. He's the grand old man of Australian letters. And the prosecutor was trying to kind of rile him up, but also try to embarrass him as well, like and make him feel kind of a bit, you know, a bit ashamed, a bit naughty. And so he pointed out this passage, he read out this passage of a sexual fantasy of the former husband of one of Portnoy's, I don't want to say she's the lover because she's not really, like he calls her the pumpkin. But anyway, but it's a sexual fantasy where the man lies beneath a glass table masturbating while above him another woman takes a dump on the table. Meanwhile, the wife is supposed to be sitting on a red damask sofa drinking a brandy. Like, it's the weirdest kind of sexual hang-up.
And it's really specific too.
It's so detailed. And he reads this, and you know, like I cringed when I read that passage in the book. I just think, oh God, gross. And he was expecting Patrick White to do the same thing, and White just kind of shrugged and said, "I've heard of worse happening in Sydney." And it's like, yep, that just gets it. Like the prosecutor just had nowhere to go. You know, worse happens in Sydney. Okay. So that was my favorite bit of it. Ridiculous.
Fantastic. All right, I'm going to start just reading through some of these questions and comments. And as I do that, I was hoping you could, as my final question for you, talk about just broadly the ramifications, like what we enjoy now and how much we enjoy now is thanks to the Trials of Portnoy.
Yeah, sure. So the big thing that happened after Portnoy was released at a federal level was that the Liberal Party lost government in 1972. Whitlam came to power with the Labor Party, and they reformed the censorship laws. And what they did in particular was they kind of said, if you're over the age of 18, you should be able to read whatever you want, and we'll just alert you to the kind of material that you're reading. So in effect, they substituted the censorship system for a classification system that we still have today. So, you have your G movies, PG, M, that kind of thing. So we still technically have censorship in Australia. We call it classification now. We understand it as classification. But that's the big kind of shift. And it is a big shift. But it's worth kind of saying that we still do have censorship. In movies, we have it. We also still have it in books. You can't buy American Psycho, for example, by Bret Easton Ellis, unless it's in shrink wrap. It's always sold in shrink wrap. And even only a couple of years ago, actually in Adelaide, cops went into a bookstore and pulled up a bookstore owner for selling the book outside of shrink wrap. So we still technically have this censorship in Australia.
What cop would do, like, I'm not saying I don't believe you, I'm saying like, God, get a life. Like that's what you want to do on the beat, like when you're, sorry, yeah, just. Okay.
It kind of, like one of the things about it is censorship is still with us. It just is a very different form. We don't have a kind of state-based censorship system like we had back in the 1950s, 60s and so on. What we have now is a kind of, on one hand, a very benign seeming censorship authority in the Film and Literature Classification Board. But we still also have instances where censorship does pop up as an undercurrent in debate and various issues. Like you can talk, I think, about libel and defamation laws within that context of censorship. But you can also talk about it within the context of industrial relations and how, so we say, certain people who have published or said things and then been sacked from their positions afterward. That can really be understood within that context of censorship, I think. Yeah, that's kind of
okay. Thank you. We have some really great questions. Two are similar, and so I'll put them sort of both to you at the same time. The first one was from quite early on in our discussion, and somebody asked, what was the general public's reaction at the time? And a second person then asked later on, do we know if Australians overall were supportive of censorship, or did they oppose the publication of Portnoy's complaint and similar texts?
We loved censorship, like loved it to bits, thought it was the bee's knees, wanted to keep it. There were opinion polls taken at the height of Portnoy's release that said that a majority of Australians either wanted the censorship system to stay as it was or to be increased, in fact, to have more powers. And there's a great telegram that I quoted in the book that was sent to Penguin when Portnoy's complaint was released, basically calling them all a bunch of gutter-dwelling perverts and dirty old men and things like this for publishing this dirty book. So Portnoy's complaint, on one hand, enjoyed a lot of public support. There was a vocal anti-censorship kind of presence and supporters within Australia, because they did obviously buy the book and they turned out in droves to support the publication of the book. But at the same time, the majority of Australians, if I'm honest, actually supported more censorship and the preservation of the censorship system. So it's an odd kind of almost conflicting. Yeah.
A follow-up question that runs on from this is from Alex. Do you think Australia remains prudish today? Yep. Agreed. Yep. So funny. Somebody has asked, they said they loved Tiberius with a telephone. What made you decide to write Trials of Portnoy instead of another political biography? And specifically, will you do another political biography?
I was pretty sick of politics after I finished up with Billy McMahon. McMahon was not exactly an admirable kind of figure. I mean, admirable in some ways, but I kind of wanted to do something that had people who were smart and intelligent doing smart and intelligent and courageous things, like publishing this book and testifying in its defense. So that's why I kind of decided to do it instead of writing another political biography. I do have ideas / hopes / vague inklings of political biography, another one to do. but not just yet, like soon. These things take time. These things take time. Yeah.
Too soon. A question from Francesca. I can't wait to read this book. Is there any footage from this period? It sounds like it would also make a great movie.
There is some footage. There's not very much because the trials themselves couldn't be obviously taped and videoed, but there is a bit of footage around. The ABC actually managed to stitch together some footage when they did a compilation kind of thing when this book first came out. And there's some great clips in there of people like Mickey and some of the booksellers and the cops going into shops and taking copies of these books and raiding off with them. It's worth tracking down. You can Google it online. It is there. Just look up Portnoy's complaint and yeah, you'll find it.
That's great. Yeah. Question from Rebecca. Will it be available as an audiobook, or is it available as an audiobook? Okay.
Yep.
The final thing from the audience that I've kept till last before I announce which books are next for B-List Book Club, so please don't run away. Patrick, this is a comment rather than a question from Michelle, but I think it's pretty good. In the late 60s or early 70s, my boyfriend had a banned copy of Portnoy's complaint, which I read and which he kept in his car's glove box. Then the car was stolen. And although he got the car back with lots of important work papers, Portnoy's complaint was gone and we never saw it again. So he never read it. I just feel like that's such a good, thank you for that, Michelle. That is a rare instance in which a comment rather than a question is good.
Wait in goal. That's great. God. Steal the car, drop the car back, keep the book. I like that person.
Maybe it was a cop who couldn't be seen to be going and buying it themselves.
Just kept the copies afterward. They seized copies from Penguin, like 75 copies or something, and they flogged them. They kept them. Ridiculous. Yeah. Cops are just as dirty as the rest of us.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Patrick, thank you so much. That was just fantastic. I loved your book so much. I'm sure if anyone listening hasn't yet read it, they will want to now. It was a real joy talking to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bri. It's been terrific.
And for our regular fans, attendees, there is a special International B-List Book Club next. We're going to be talking to Rumaan Alam, who's written Leave the World Behind, which is essentially a thriller. It's not very long, and it's a real page turner, really entertaining, but also is an incredible examination of race and class, particularly in America, but of course, everywhere. And it's just made the shortlist for the National Book Award in the States. So it's a real treat that I get to interview him about this book. The event with Rumaan is going to go live on the 11th of November, but because he's in America, we have to pre-record it. So via my sort of social media or emails, I'm just accepting anyone who has questions for Rumaan Alam. You can just message me what your question is, and I will still be happy to put audience questions to him after I have asked him all of mine. And then the next and final regular programming B-List for the year for November is Upturn, A Better Normal After COVID-19, edited by Tanya Plibersek. That's going to be on November the 26th, and my guest will be Tanya Plibersek herself. And I think it's a really perfect book with which to end the year because it goes across, like there are so many contributors, it goes across a whole lot of different issues, and there is an inherently, obviously, optimistic tone about it. You know, there's just been so many changes this year. If we think about what we want for our country, what might it look like to start doing things differently from 2021 onwards. So I hope you can join us for either one of those. And once more, really, really thank you so much, Patrick, for joining us, and have a lovely evening, everybody.
Cheers.
Night, night.
Good night.